No. Hi, everyone. This is Craig Zelzer from PCDN Global here for the latest episode of our Social Change Career Podcast. This is Season 10, Episode 15, I think. So I think I got that right. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Today, we're here with Sam Wilks. I'm just trying to check. Apologies for any technical difficulties. It's not showing as working on LinkedIn, so just give me a second. I'm going to double check if it's working. And then, sorry, apologies, everybody. It should be working. Yeah, okay, here it is. Apologies for that. I got a little error message. So starting 100% over. Welcome, everyone, to the PCDN Social Change Career Podcast. This is Season 10, Episode 15. We're here with Sam Wilks, who's a brilliant innovator, social expert, product management expert, has worked in health, tech, and social impact around the world, including very extensive experience in Africa, working on health issues, and also is now working on tech and coffee. Since I live in Colombia, all things coffee are wonderful to hear about. We'd love to hear where people are joining us from. So if you're watching this now on LinkedIn, please use the comment box to share a little bit about yourself, where you're watching from, and a sentence or two about your background. We also like to bring in questions and comments at any time during the podcast live stream. So please feel free to share, your questions and comments. This usually goes about 45 minutes. Immediately after this is done, it'll be converted on LinkedIn and YouTube. You can watch it, the recording, and then within about a month, it'll be converted to one of our 100+ episodes of the Social Change Career Podcast. The one area we would like to request your assistance, if you're watching this or listening to this in the future, please consider rating the podcast on whatever platform you listen to, Spotify, Apple, Google, Podcast Addict. Every rating you do helps us grow our reach and impact. So thank you so much. We have lots of other exciting episodes coming up, and you can go to PCDN Global to search through the other episodes. So Sam Wilks got over 10 years experience in the tech industry. He's played a crucial role in building 2 health tech startups in East Africa. He's currently involved with Crop Connects, which is a startup focused on building a marketplace and supply chain management tool for green coffee. He's passionate about leveraging tech for social impact, building social enterprises, and advancing global health initiatives. He has strong expertise both as a generalist and also product specific, and is deeply committed to advancing sustainable change, both in Canada and around the world. So Sam, thank you so much for joining us today. Wonderful to have you on the podcast. If there's anything else you'd like to add to your bio, I just did a quick summary that you would like people to know.
No, I think you nailed it.
Okay. So can you talk a little bit about what is the type of change that you've been focused on advancing in your career, and how do you go about trying to measure that change? Is it stories? Is it data, growth in revenue, users?
Yeah, good question. Broadly, I've been working to push change through tech in emerging markets. As you said in the bio, this has mostly been in health tech. But as you also mentioned, currently wrapping up a project in coffee, which has been kind of cool change. And there, the impact angle is wealth and prosperity development in rural areas. I got into software because I was really excited about its potential to create change at scale. But what I found as my career has developed is that, especially in emerging markets, people often fall into the kind of if you have a hammer, everything is a nail problem, and kind of assume that tech can solve all challenges. And so the kind of change that I've been kind of working to develop and work on more as I progress in my career is, instead of being kind of solely focused on kind of pure tech solutions, building out a wider skill set to apply knowledge across other domains like business, supply chain, and public health. And in terms of how I measure it, in the organizations that I have worked for before, we looked at a number of different things. So at Maisha Meds, which was the first organization I was working with in East Africa, doing kind of access to medicine, The primary metric we were looking at was the number of active pharmacies that were using our software, because the idea was to kind of generate data to give visibility into which medications were being used at the kind of last mile distribution. Then at Alara Health, we were much more focused on revenue, but also in terms of the number of tests that were being done on the devices that we were distributing, and the number of patient records in the EMR that we ended up building. So metrics vary, but in health, it has generally been just looking at the number of patients that have been impacted. And then, at Crop Connects, we are still pretty early. And so the focus on Crop Connects has really been getting revenue off the ground, because if you can't be sustainable, then you can't drive change at all. So,
So wonderful. And thank you. Great to see you, Paula, from the Kroc School, Nitish from Nepal, and Christina from Paris. And please keep letting us know where you're watching from, and a sentence or two about your background, and feel free to start asking questions. So Sam, can you talk about when you were younger? I mean, not that you're old now, but all the research says it's generally not a good idea to ask kids what they want to be when they grow up, but focus more on what are some challenges or opportunities they want to work on. But when you think back to being a teenager or even prior, did you envision yourself in a particular career role? And then how in the world did you wind up at least starting to work at this intersection?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I've always been interested in a lot of different things. I was pretty heavily influenced. So I knew very early on that I wanted to do something that had some social good. I was really heavily inspired early on by my dad, who had started a children's young adult book publishing company. Quick plug for Enact Press if anyone has read any of Robert Munch's books. And my dad always had a very clear idea of why he was doing what he was doing. He believed in the stories that he was publishing. He believed in the impact that the arts can have on promoting culture, on empowering people. He did some very early stuff in feminism, which I still think is incredibly cool. And so that was always a really major motivation for my career, was having something that I believed as deeply in as my dad did. When I was younger, I was interested in all sorts of things that I still remain interested in now. I thought I was going to be a writer at some point. Obviously, I've taken a very different path to that. I was interested in politics when I was younger. I think that the way that I kind of ended up where I ended up was I think a baseline kind of curiosity and interest in travel and just seeing the world and experiencing different cultures and seeing how people lived in different ways. And I think when I was younger, I thought that everybody had that kind of drive, but it's something that I realized that a lot of my friends were kind of more content just, staying in Toronto and kind of living their lives. And so that was kind of how the interest in more kind of global issues started, was just through, I was privileged enough to be able to travel a lot when I was younger. And then in high school, I kind of developed an interest in tech. And as I said before, got really excited about the potential that tech can have to implement change at scale. I would say, I'm making it sound like that was like a very kind of direct, clear career path, but I meandered a lot. I did spend some time in Toronto, spent some time in San Francisco, did a bunch of things that didn't quite work for me. And then what kind of brought it all together was landing in Kenya for what I thought was going to be a 4-month post-graduation internship at Maisha Meds, and then turned into over 5 years and 2 organizations, and really like a very defining period in my life.
Okay, wonderful. Great to see you, Mary Jo. We have to have a chat sometime. She works in sustainability. Welcome, Imram from Ghana. Welcome, Sade, I think, from Ethiopia. Please let us know your questions and comments. So can you talk a little bit in terms of undergrad, what you studied, and also how in the world did you wind up in Kenya? Were you thinking about East Africa? Your school had a connection, and you started off at Maisha Meds, or you went to Kenya to do something else? And how in the world, I think that's often the best when things aren't planned, it's just serendipitous. But how in the world, what stage was the company at when you showed up? And how in the world did it turn into 5 years, both there and at other startups?
Yeah. Okay. There's a lot there. So I guess to start, in undergrad, I studied business and computer science, which was really great for my career. I think that if there's anyone listening who is kind of earlier on, like that was a very focused degree, and I kind of wish I'd had a bit more fun and taken some things that were kind of outside of the traditional career path, but I also may not be where I am now without it. So, take everything with a grain of salt, I guess. I had a series of, I would say, pretty serendipitous things that led me to East Africa. I went to the University of Waterloo in Canada, which, for those that don't know, is a bit of a feeder school for Silicon Valley. And the culture there is really that, you need to go to the US, you need to go and get your get your bona fides in San Francisco or in New York. And that's really the direction that everybody is going. And I just kind of had this feeling that there was other really interesting stuff going on in the world. And I think that I was also like a bit less of a technologist for technology's sake and more of a technologist for the sake of kind of impacting other fields. And so had a bit of a divergent viewpoint from the rest of the people in my school. And so ended up writing for the school paper and doing a column where I wrote about tech hubs around the world. And that was kind of how I discovered that there were a lot of really interesting things happening in East Africa. And then it turns out one of the founders of Andela and then Flutterwave, but at the time just Andela, which for those that don't know is a huge kind of talent and engineering kind of dev house essentially based on the continent, based out of Nigeria. And he read one of my articles and loved it. And so I ended up chatting with him, and that kind of like continued it. And so the idea behind my year off was going to be like 4 months of study, 4 months of travel, and then 4 months of work. And was just because of that interest in what was happening on the continent already, I decided that I would do my 4 months of work somewhere in Africa. And I mean, it makes a lot of sense to me now that it ended up being Nairobi, because the city has such a vibrant tech scene and such a vibrant startup scene, and there's kind of so many people doing so many interesting things. And yeah, I got the job at Maisha Meds really just by Googling companies doing interesting things. I had kind of chosen that I was going to work in either education or health because they were interesting impact fields for me. And when I joined, Maisha Meds was really essentially the earliest stage that you could be. They had a kind of proof of concept product, but I started by essentially rebuilding it from the ground up. They hired me because they had just received a grant from the Gates Foundation, which meant that they had some runway. Really, I joined at kind of the beginning of developing that vision, and got to see it grow, which was very cool.
Wonderful. So I really love that story. Like you were doing something you were passionate about in the school paper, and then that just led to interesting opportunities that led to an entire career. Obviously, you had the skills and experience, but that led to this whole career. So 2 things here. So first is, can you talk a little bit about the skills that you're using now, let's say 10 years later, on a daily basis or regular basis? How much did you develop in your double major? And what are the most useful skills, and how much have you developed along the way?
Yeah, I mean, the skills that I'm definitely still using from school are the technical skills, and they have been invaluable in a way that I don't think I really fully anticipated. I think going into that program, I kind of knew that I wasn't going to be a software engineer forever. But I think having that technical foundation is like kind of a bit of a kind of proof that you're smart kind of thing, which you can have your own opinions on whether that's true for me, but it definitely is a valuable signal. And then just being able to kind of, even if you're not working on engineering teams, I think understanding how engineering teams work and how engineering more broadly works, how software works, how software delivery works, even if you're doing ops or strategy or something that is like not directly related, I think that that's a really valuable skill set. And then what I picked up on the way, to kind of go back to the title of the podcast, is how to be a generalist, and how, and this was really from working in smaller organizations where if you don't do it, nobody does it. But I think one of the most valuable skill sets, especially more in the last kind of 4 or 5 years of my career, has been learning to take any problem. I mean, not any problem. There are some things that you really have to have a technical skill set to do, but to take problems that I maybe don't have an explicit background in and just learn, And I think like in the last in the last year, I switched industries, a totally new set of problems. I'd never done anything explicitly kind of coordinating supply chain. And so really had to put that to the test in terms of just being able to like take a problem that we were working on and just kind of dive in through a combination of networking and like talking to mentors, talking to people in the industry, trying to figure out ways of connecting with people that have knowledge in the in whatever kind of problem you're trying to solve, and doing that mostly on your own. I mean, obviously you want to have a good team, but being able to do that in a self-directed way has been really important.
Sorry, someone's doing a little bit of work outside, so I'm unmuting. So two questions here. Can you talk, since you've mostly been part of early stage startups, a lot of people who listen to the podcast, some are junior, most people have 8 to 15 years experience. So for people who are thinking about the next step in their career or first step, what are the advantages of joining an early stage startup or social enterprise? And what are some cautions, not specific to any one company, but you'd say, like, if you're looking for stability or if you're looking for X, maybe it may not be the right place.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start. The advantages are you really get to do everything. Like, you have to wear a lot of hats. You get a lot of exposure to what it's like to start a business, kind of regardless of your role, because you have to learn those kinds of things. And so, I mean, if you want to be a generalist and you want to pick up a wide range of skills, then I think, if you work for a bigger company, there's not a terrible chance that you'll end up working on kind of a tiny piece of a much larger machine. And in a startup, you end up working on like essentially the entire machine. And it also gives you, that's a little bit directed based on your own interests. Like, in some sense, you have to work on other things, but in other senses, if you want to be more focused, you can be. So there is some choice there. But just know when you're getting into it that in a lot of cases, if you don't do it, nobody can do it. And so I would say that is the biggest upside in terms of skills. I mean, this has never been a huge driver for me, but obviously there is potentially a financial upside. You also, in terms of cash, you probably will not make as much as if you worked at a larger organization. But if you choose the right organization early, obviously the payoff there can be huge. If you're interested in getting into work in Africa, you can't really, you might get returns that are similar to what you would get in the US or Europe, but chances are, like, the continent still doesn't have a great track record for exits, although they certainly exist. And then in terms of downsides, it can certainly be chaotic, and I think it's harder to time box your time, and I think you have to be a lot more intentional in terms of saying, this is where my work life stops, and this is where my kind of personal life starts. And so I would say that would probably, like, maintaining work-life balance and not burning out. It's going to be a problem in any organization, but at startups, I think you have to be a bit more intentional about it, because, again, like, it's kind of this, especially if you're in a more senior role, if you don't do things right, then that could, in a really extreme case, that could mean the success of the company. And obviously you have a good team around you, and if you choose your team wisely, this is much less of an issue, but you're responsible for a lot more. And so there is certainly more pressure.
Yeah, Catalina and I do small scale angel investing. And so not everyone would know what it means to work for an early stage startup. So can you talk a little bit about, if you're one of the early employees, and it depends on the level, there's usually a salary package, hopefully, and some benefits, hopefully, but just kind of deconstruct a little bit about equity, because not everyone watching the podcast would know. And, what are the advantages and disadvantages? High risk, but potentially high reward. So what does it mean to get potential equity?
Yeah. So, in most cases, if you join an early stage startup, even if you don't join an early stage startup, in most cases, if the company is not huge, you will get some amount of employee stock. And basically what that will do is pad your salary. The thing with stock that I was told a number of years ago that I think is the most helpful way to think about it is that it's either worth a lot or it's worth nothing. And that is not true in all cases. So basically the way that it works is you will get stock that is valued at it'll have what's called a strike price, which is how much you need to pay to kind of exercise. This is for stock options, which is the most common form of employee equity plans. So you'll get a strike price on your options. Let's say that's like 10 cents a share, just to keep it easy, to make it easy. And then the longer you're there, the more that stock will increase in value. There's also something called the vesting schedule, which I won't get into. That's probably too much in the weeds. But essentially, your stock will increase in value with the company. And so if the company does well, your stock will be worth more. So maybe in 3 years, it'll be worth 50 cents a share or $1 a share. And then you can essentially buy it for 10 cents a share and immediately sell it back for $1 a share. The reason it's often worth nothing is because in order to get that $1 a share, there needs to be what's called a liquidity event. And so that might be like an initial public offering or an IPO. It could also be that you're just selling to an investor who wants more equity in the company when they go in. So there are different ways to exit. The company could also be bought. That's another way that you can have a liquidity event. But the company needs to do well enough for that to happen. And so there's also a pretty good chance for most companies that your stock ends up being worthless. And so that's where the risk comes in.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. So can you talk a little bit about the social challenges or opportunities that the different companies you've worked for have been trying to address, and then how they've tried to incorporate a business model, in terms of for-profit to make their work and impact sustainable?
Yeah, well, so I'll start with Maisha Meds, which I should say. I'll give the whole story of kind of the arc that we went through at Maisha Meds, which was that to start off, we thought that we could fundamentally the problem we were trying to solve at the beginning was that you have all of these kind of mom and pop pharmacies. They're called Duka Ladawas in kind of Swahili, East Africa, but they have different names all over the continent. How can you essentially digitize these pharmacies and then use the data from the digitization in interesting ways? Because there's this problem where no one is really sure what is getting sold at that level. You kind of just lose visibility in the supply chain once you get down to the last mile. And that kind of evolved over time into being more broadly about access to medicine. And this was kind of happening around the time I was leaving, but where the companies ultimately landed is building a kind of voucher program, in addition to some other things, where large funders can essentially run reimbursement programs through the pharmacies in Maisha Meds network. So let's say you want to fund family planning for teenage women. You could go to Maisha Meds and say, hey, we have this basket of medicine. We want to subsidize it for people who fit this criteria. And then the network could administer it. In terms of business model, we were trying, the thing that pharmaceuticals is in generally a pretty good business, but you have to have the right margins. And so we, while I was there, we tried a medication ordering service, which would allow pharmacies to order medication through the app, and would kind of give them intelligence on what they should order, what their stock levels were, all of those kinds of things. Ultimately, the company decided to go fully grant funded. So all of the money for that they were running on came. This was, I think mostly from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I guess now just the Gates Foundation, and from USAID. So in that sense, they ultimately didn't really work out a business model. I know it's still something that they're thinking about, but my information is pretty out of date, so I'm going to stop talking there because I don't really know where they're at with it right now. And then at Elara Health, the fundamental problem that Elara was founded on was addressing the diagnostics gap in East Africa. And so there's a few different ways of kind of explaining this, but the easiest one is that essentially a lot of traditional hospital lab equipment and diagnostic equipment is very expensive. So the easiest example is, let's say, an ultrasound device. If you want a high quality ultrasound device, that's going to run you $100,000 easily. Even the cheap ones are somewhere in the $10,000 range, which is completely out of the question for most of the kind of small to mid-sized clinics that make up a lot of the kind of health system in East Africa and in Kenya specifically. And so what we were doing and what they're still doing is to source. There's this whole new generation of kind of high-tech, low-cost diagnostic devices that use things like AI and just like new kind of software integrated tech to connect to phones or tablets to drive down the overall cost of the machine. And so we could bring those in, distribute them to pharmacies, or sorry, to clinics, and give access to tests for detection and prevention of diseases. And then as we moved, we realized that one of the kind of foundational problems that these facilities have is that they don't have any electronic medical record systems. And so, as the company has grown, they have kind of got into more and more parts of the clinic. And so now they have a medication ordering program. Again, there's kind of a few different business models that everybody is circling around, but medication ordering tends to be pretty good. They've done some financing, training, and kind of building out a kind of playbook for clinics to use to both improve health outcomes and business practices, because these are all kind of private, out-of-pocket clinics. And then the electronic medical record system, or EMR, kind of underlies all of that and provides data to facilitate the effective delivery of those programs. And then to quickly do Crop Connects, the idea is that farmers in general who are growing coffee can make more money if they can sell directly to international markets. And so from an impact perspective, if you can help those farmers access international markets more effectively, they will get more of the kind of that final cost of the coffee. A lot of value is lost in the local supply chain because often quality isn't known until it kind of reaches an exporter, and often that money doesn't go back to farmers. That's a very quick kind of overview.
Thank you so much, and it's very impressive. And there was a great documentary, I think from about 10 years ago, I think it was called Black Gold, about the coffee industry. I'll try to look it up and put it in the chat, but it really talks about how much, and it's true in a lot of agricultural products that are exported, through the supply chain, like the farmers often get pennies on the dollar or whatever currency of what, at the end of the supply chain, what the distributors or, the shops are doing. So a little bit just like, what in the world is, not everybody speaks tech. So what in the world is a product manager or project manager versus a coder? I mean, I'm not asking you to explain all of tech, but like across your jobs, like, have you been more a product manager or more senior? And like, what in the world does that mean for people who don't speak tech?
Yeah, no, good question. So the way that so most tech teams kind of have like three different components. You have your engineering team, which are doing the actual coding, and building out the product. The engineering team works closely with the design team, who are the ones who are providing the kind of visual interface for the engineers to build. And then both of those teams kind of take their cues from the product team. And the product team's role is to be a kind of middle person between engineering, design, and then the business side. So in general, the way it would work is that you would have these kind of high level goals or KPIs, key performance indicators, that come from the business team. We have these revenue targets, we have these targets that we've told to investors about our user growth or about our impact metrics or whatever. And it's the product team's job to kind of interface with the business team, go out and try to figure out with users how to achieve the goals that the business team has set. And I'm making it sound like that goes in one direction. Like often the way it should work is that you go out and you talk to users, and then you bring that back and work with the business team to establish those high level goals. And then you work with design to figure out what the visual interface for it should look like, what the user experience should be like. And then those specifications are then passed to the engineering team, who actually built the product. So that's kind of the high level overview of how these things. And
what in your various roles and capacities, what do you find the most exciting part of, and obviously it's different for each person. So is it going out and talking to existing or potential users and really figuring out what are the challenges, or is it building the best product possible or launching it, or these beta launch? Like what do you find the most exciting part? And is there parts that, every job has parts that are more frustrating? Is there any part that you're kind of like, well, you got to do it, but maybe it's not?
Yeah, no, great question. I mean, I would say the two things that I like the most are, discovery, implementation, and strategy. would be the three biggest ones. Discovery, like I think that especially in the context of East Africa, but anywhere, I think really understanding users. Like I love people. It's why I love management. It's why I think I got into being a product person in the first place. And so being able to go out and talk to people and understand their lives and how they think about this problem area that you're working on, I've always found deeply rewarding. But I think if I stopped there, it would be like, I don't think that would be like fulfilling kind of enough for me. And so then you kind of have to take that information and synthesize it into a strategy, which is just like kind of fun intellectual work. You know, it involves incorporating cues from the larger market. It involves figuring out, kind of working with all of these different teams to figure out what the best way of kind of designing the solution is going to be. And then implementation is fun. And the way implementation works will vary a lot across different teams. In East Africa, it tends to be really scrappy. But it's fun it's really fun and gratifying to see your work kind of out in the world, and you put something out and it's like maybe you're a little embarrassed by it, but people like it, and then you incorporate that feedback. And I think that like that iteration is really exciting because you're kind of working on things. I mean, you should never be working on things totally on your own, but you're kind of working on things and you never really know how it's going to work until people are really using it. And so going through that process is really gratifying.
Wonderful. Welcome Osamang from Kenya. Welcome Kalina from Canada, and a few other people have joined. So across your career, I imagine you've helped hire or overseen hiring or contributed. Mm-hmm. And so can you talk about two aspects of hiring? So one, just any tips for people who are looking for social impact jobs, whether it's marketing, coding, mm-hmm. engineering, or something else. And then just a little bit about the metrics, when you've helped to, hi, Justin's here from DevX, great to see you here from London. And when you've actually done the hiring, a little bit about metrics. So you've got X number of applications on average, and just walk people through the process from let's say you're not the recruiting end, but you're playing a role, like how many interviews, how many steps are there, do you test for skills and aptitudes? Just a little bit about demystifying that process.
Yeah, no, for sure. I guess on finding social impact jobs, I mean, I think there are kind of two. I mean, first of all, I would say that the best advice that I can give is figure out what area you're interested in and then try to build your network as effectively as possible, because I have found that if you can find one person who is really plugged into a space, that can be enough for you to get a lot of coverage really quickly. And then I would say once you have that coverage, just try to have conversations. Don't worry about a job. Don't worry about a specific JD. Just like try to talk to people who you think are doing interesting things in the space, because I found that I personally have gotten a lot further doing that rather than looking for like an individual JD. Now, I also think that works a lot better in a startup environment. And so if you're interested in larger organizations or getting into the social impact space for NGOs or for the UN, I have less experience there. And I think that the process would probably be a bit different. Although I do think that having conversations with people is always a good foundation. There just may be more formality later. There was something else I was going to say on this, but now I forget what it is. So I'll answer the second part of your question. I mean, in general, so I've built a few different teams, and I think there are a few things that so obviously in any scenario, I'm getting kind of, I mean, I'm somewhat pulling these numbers out of the air, but somewhere around like maybe 100 to 200 applicants per position, which in the grand scheme of things is not a lot, compared to what you would get at a really big kind of well-known organization, but it's still a lot to filter through. And so, I think, my process is a bit different for technical applicants than for non-technical applicants. I think for technical applicants, what I'm looking for is any indication that you can code and that you can kind of deliver on that. And so from a early kind of filtering mechanism, I kind of hate to admit this, but like you always look for brand names, and that doesn't need to be like Google or Meta or whatever. It can be well-known organizations within the space. That's always a good indicator that someone has a kind of baseline level of skills if they have worked with someone else before. If you haven't, then I would just say evidence that, because the hiring process for juniors is definitely different. And I think the biggest thing that I look for when hiring, especially junior engineers, is have you done personal projects? Have you contributed to any open source projects? That can be like a really good way of kind of getting your foot in the door, is just showing like, hey, I can code. I don't expect a junior engineer to be able to, build the whole thing independently, but just showing that you kind of have some experience there. And then for non-technical applicants, I think it becomes a bit more important to have like some sector experience. That's less true of junior applicants, but I think like showing that you understand, if you're applying for a job in health, showing that you understand health. And if not, then showing that you have like kind of some previous experience in that skill set. I got some great advice recently that was, if you you kind of need to choose either choose an industry and learn everything you can about that industry, or choose a skill set and go really deep on that skill set, and then you can go across industry. So I think like kind of choose one of those and try to make sure that your resume reflects that. And so that if I see that, I kind of know how to evaluate you. And then in terms of the actual process, the best hiring advice that I've ever received is the best way to know if someone is good at a job is to get them to actually do the job. And so I always try to give, I usually have like a 3 or 4 stage interview process that doesn't include kind of cultural interviews, where there's a phone screen, then a practical assessment, then especially if you're technical, probably another live practical assessment. And I try to match it. Usually what I'll try to do is pull a real problem that we're working on, and just have like walk through that problem with people. If it's a technical interview, then maybe a coding challenge for a part of our real system that is kind of isolated. And if non-technical, then a case study or something along those lines.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks so much. So Mary Jo is asking, and we actually did our PhDs together, so nice to see you, Mary Jo. So she's asking about, let's say, as someone not from East Africa, since you worked in East Africa for many years, did you, from 2 different perspectives, one, did you encounter any cultural challenges about working in a different continent or a different work culture? Mm-hmm. And then the second thing is, how can you better increase cross-cultural competency? So did you learn by doing? Do you speak Swahili? Obviously most people speak English, or just your tips for others who want to work, let's say, in regions or cultures outside of where they were born.
Yeah, I would say, so I guess on the first question, yes, absolutely. There was a certain amount of kind of culture shock when I got in, and I certainly had to learn to navigate a different way of doing things. And I was really young, and I just kind of, I think as young people do, I had maybe a brash amount of confidence, and just kind of my approach when I got to East Africa and I was 23 and just like so excited to be there, was really just to kind of like put my head down and try to learn as much as I could, as quickly as I could. I think that my advice for really learn by doing. Like I tried to integrate as quickly as possible. I had like lots of really, really amazing conversations with colleagues and with the friends that I was making. And I think that, just kind of my advice for people looking to do that. Now, Kenya is English speaking. Everybody there speaks English. So there would be different advice if you also have to pick up a language. But my advice for people who are looking to kind of have these cross-cultural experiences is, arrive and have as open a mind as you possibly can. Try to really invest time and energy in understanding the local culture, in making friends, in developing relationships, because I think it's really easy in a lot of parts of the world to just kind of like move abroad and then fall into an expat bubble where you're only hanging out with people who are culturally similar to you. And I think you lose a lot of the richness of that experience if you're not conscious about kind of pulling yourself out of that. Because I think in any situation, anywhere in the world, your default is going to be to hang out with people that are comfortable, because there's always going to be some amount of effort in bridging cultural barriers. And that's just going to, like, whether it's subconscious or conscious, going to take a little bit more work. But I cannot stress enough how worth it is to put in that work and to really try to become involved in the community and really like leave yourself open to learning. I guess to kind of quickly address the language question, which is a bit different. I was recently just traveling in Latin America, and I found even just trying to learn Spanish. I mean, I was there for 4 months. I certainly didn't get that far with Spanish, but just really like putting in a conscious effort can go a really long way towards people kind of just showing that you're really making an effort can go a long way. And I think that if you stop there and only kind of make an effort, then you won't get the full experience out of it. But it is really worth it to try to learn the local language.
Wonderful. Thanks. Welcome, Idris from Yemen. Feel free to add your questions and comments. So a related question, I mean, Catalina and I, as I said, we do small scale angel investing, very small. We've invested in quite a few startups across Africa, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Latin America. But there is such a huge funding gap in terms of like how much goes to, I wouldn't just say tech bros, but people in the global north who are often developing solutions to try in the global south versus people from whatever you want to call it, rest of the world or global south, who are building potential solutions rooted more in local context. So any thoughts about kind of this, and funding is increasing in, Kenya, they have the Silicon Savannah, Medellin's trying to position itself as one of the hubs for innovation in Latin America. But any thoughts about like both in terms of the talent, well, not the talent, the opportunity divide, and also just the funding? Do you see it changing? Has it changed? Like, is there much more both development and grant funding and startup funding for innovations coming from the regions? Or is it still a lot of people, trying to, not that they have negative intentions, but there's a lot of hackathons, like let's build a problem to solve, it's not a hackathon about building something in their communities, which sometimes is, but like, let's solve that problem for those people far away. So any thoughts about that? And welcome Abdul from Italy. So.
Hold on, sorry, my computer is yelling at me about something.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess first of all, like I want to start by saying certainly there are systemic inequities that make it harder for local founders to raise money, that make it harder often for local employees to get senior positions, and so these are definitely issues. I think what I'm seeing, or what I have been seeing over the course of my career, is a shift. There's a lot more emphasis on trying to fund kind of local organizations. Often those local organizations will have some foreign founders. And I think that in a lot of ways, that's a good thing. Like I think cross-cultural exchange, bringing in ideas from other places to kind of try them in emerging markets can be really healthy if done right. But I do think it's extremely important to be local. I think that there's less of developing a solution in a hackathon in San Francisco and then kind of implementing it in East Africa now, partly because that just doesn't work. And so even if you are taking like a purely kind of capitalist, I want to make as much money as I can on this solution kind of perspective, there's lots of these kind of like, kind of asset light tech ideas that get developed in emerging in like developed markets, and then like they are attempted at kind of transplanting them, and what you find is they just don't work. And so I think you really need that local context, and I think solutions are much more effective when you have that local context. And I think that the larger investment community, and I should say that I've never explicitly been, like I've been involved in fundraising, but I've never like led fundraising. So I have a bit of a secondhand perspective on this. But there is certainly a lot more attention being given. And there are a lot of investors that say like, we won't fund your company unless you have a local founder or like a strong local team. One thing that I've always really appreciated about the Nairobi ecosystem is that for the most part, the companies are based there. And there are some exceptions. There are some companies that have teams that are based elsewhere. But there is certainly, as far as larger trends go, a shift towards having everybody at least based in one of the kind of foundational countries that these companies are operating in.
Okay. Not everyone knows about M-Pesa, but what do you think are some of the most interesting innovations that have come from Ushahidi or M-Pesa? Like, what are some innovations that come from Kenya or East Africa that you have already had huge impact and maybe grown to other places, or just things you wish others would know about, kind of some cool things that have grown out of that ecosystem?
Yeah, great question. I mean, M-Pesa is the obvious answer. And so for those that don't know, M-Pesa is a mobile money product that essentially allows people using any phone, smartphone, feature phone, dumb phone, so to say, to store and transfer money. And so crucially, it's not a banking solution. Like, you know, I would still say people that are only on only using M-Pesa are still quote unquote unbanked. But M-Pesa is like, it's hard to overstate how foundational M-Pesa is to the Kenyan economy and ecosystem. Essentially, what it means is that you can, send and transfer money on your phone. It has, for a lot of people, replaced kind of stuffing your mattress with cash, which has obvious problems. And every single business from your kind of local fruit seller all the way up to your fanciest restaurants will all accept payment via mobile money. And that solution has, M-Pesa has inspired countless spin-offs in emerging markets around the world. And I think it's a great example of how tech in East Africa has kind of leapfrogged over the rest of the world. Countries that have these large traditional banking systems have a lot of entrenched interests for not having this kind of stuff come through. And so, you know, obviously there are innovations like Venmo and stuff like that in the US, but M-Pesa is a wonderful solution, and in a lot of ways is easier than these kind of developed market innovations. Outside of M-Pesa, I mean, I would say something that, like, I think that East Africa has really embraced the gig economy in a really interesting way. And I think that might just be surprising to people who haven't been there. I don't have data on how effective that has been in terms of improving living standards and stuff like that. So I don't want to go too far into saying this is definitely a kind of I don't want to say that this is an example of something that they're necessarily doing better than developed markets. The other big area is around solar power, and there's some solar bus companies that are doing really well. There's like a lot of transportation in East Africa is around motorcycle taxis. In Kenya, they're called bodabodas. And there's a big push to electrify those. There's also just a lot of kind of off-grid solutions and solar solutions that are working to electrify. Less so in Kenya. Kenya Power has like pretty good coverage. But for other East African countries, solar power is pretty cool. And then I do think in healthcare, there is going to be, especially around electronic medical records, there is a big opportunity to leapfrog over what's happening in developed markets. Kind of coming from Kenya, where a lot of the problems are digitization, there are entrenched players that are slow to act in Canada and the US in terms of providing electronic medical records. And I think that Africa has this opportunity to kind of jump over that and have this kind of dream of a centralized patient record where, regardless of what hospital you go to, your records are all in one place. They're kind of collected. And so I don't know if that's necessarily going to happen. It's going to require a lot of collaboration between the public sector and the private sector. And there's a number of different players that are in that market. And so I think it's going to be, or in those markets. And so I think it's going to be a little while until we see that shape out. But I think there's a big opportunity to leapfrog there.
Okay. Wonderful. I think M-Pesa, Safaricom, Ushahidi, there's a lot. And I would say, having lived lots of countries, but Colombia the past 5.5 years, sometimes we joke that like the digital ecosystem is so much further advanced than the US in terms of payments and transactions. But then the bureaucracy is like way behind the US in a lot of ways. Like if you need to get something notarized, it's so common. Like you can do so it's like in some ways we're jumped ahead of the US, and in other ways we're so far behind. But I think the digital payment ecosystems and a lot of that is just the US is so far behind in those things.
So on just quickly on digital payments, like the sector that is by far the most developed in like across the continent is fintech. It's where all of the biggest exits have happened. Like Paystack was not so recently anymore, but relatively recently bought by Stripe. And in general, the payment stack which is just, for those that don't know what that means, is just like all of the tools that allow you to kind of move and transfer and hold money, is by far the most developed tech ecosystem. And I think is, including M-Pesa, but there's like a whole bunch of different levels on top of that, that connect banking systems and mobile money systems. That is certainly the most developed part of the African tech ecosystem.
Thank you. Welcome, Kalina. Good to see you again. Just mentioning she lives in Canada and runs an all-volunteer initiative, Teachers for Ukraine. So please check it out. I think she put the link here. So please, it's a great organization. So if you're interested in education, and obviously, Kathleen and I invested a tiny bit in Basico, I think is the name. It's we have an electric car. We had no car for years. We bought a Beat electric car, which is amazing. I don't want to ever buy a gas car. And so they're using Beat technology for electric buses for the Kenyan market. So super cool, because obviously pollution, air quality pollution in many places, including the global north, is a huge challenge. But in Medellin, it's bad, in Bogota, and so that the more we can electrify. So just a couple more questions. And again, if anyone has questions or comments, feel free to put them in. So one thing is your thoughts. I'm not asking you to be, and two things. Let's start with something. There's a saying that opportunity is not universally distributed, talent is. Mm-hmm. And so unemployment is a huge challenge around the world, but especially in countries like Kenya or Pakistan or Colombia. In Colombia, there's a saying called the NIMI generation, neither in formal education nor formal employment. And prior to the pandemic, even during the pandemic, we had mass social protests about lots of issues. I mean, they still happen, but a lot of that was like, what's the future for young people? Mm-hmm. So anything, what are your thoughts on that? Let's say generating more economic opportunity. Is it happening? And then when you put in the gigification of everything, just thoughts around, whether it's in Canada or East Africa.
Yeah, I mean, I should say that I'm certainly not an expert on this, but in East Africa, I would say things were getting better. My understanding is that there's Kenya certainly, and I think the rest of the continent has gotten hit kind of hard by the post-COVID economic collapse, and so I think some of the gains that were being made have been lost. To speak specifically about tech, the growth of learning platforms and accelerators and kind of coding boot camps has been really exceptional. In Kenya, the kind of company that comes to mind is Moringa School, who have done a ton of amazing work training a whole generation of software engineers that have been moving into the space and really driving a lot of the technical development. And so I think in a lot of ways that's really good. I sometimes worry about there being a kind of developer class because the wage differences between technical employees and non-technical employees are huge. I don't have good data on what the implications of that are, so I'll stop there. I'm kind of I think fundamentally it is good that more people are being employed, and it is certainly helping to grow the middle class. So that is really good, and I think there are a lot of opportunities in the tech ecosystem. There are a lot of organizations that are paying better than their kind of traditional counterparts, and so certainly in terms of like startup ecosystem, there's a lot of really good work being done there. In Canada, my impression, and this is something that now I'm really kind of talking outside of my expertise, but I think the economy is just in a weird place right now. And I think there are some industries that are really not doing well. For example, like tech in Canada and the US has contracted quite a bit. I think a lot of that contraction is the result of overly aggressive expansion during COVID and kind of more of a return to baseline. I also tend to think that it's probably healthy for the ecosystem in general. And I think this applies to the African tech ecosystem as well, that like kind of the expression, like the tide has gone out and we've seen who's swimming naked. And I think that ultimately that ends up leading to healthier organizations. So, the obvious example is like Amazon made it through the .com bubble and are now one of the biggest companies in the world. And so I think that often when you have these kind of contractions, companies need to focus on fundamentals, and that ultimately leads to healthier, larger businesses that end up having more sustainable long-term employment opportunities. So, yeah.
Thank you. So we have a couple of minutes left. Kennedy, thanks for the comments. Saeed, again, please feel free to bring in your questions, and you've got people from all over the world. So one thing there, let's say about 10 years ago, there was a push for everyone to become a coder, or at least understand.
Yeah.
And then now there's the push. Finland's the world leader in this, that people need at least basic AI literacy. So just any thoughts, like with the rapid emergence of machine learning and building a much more robust AI, which has a lot of dangers and opportunities, like for people who want to work at this intersection of tech and social impact, whether it's private sector, nonprofit, multilateral, like obviously it depends on the role, but do you recommend they explore coding, just get familiar with no coding tools, get some basic AI literacy, or just recommendations for both? I mean, I'm diving into AI. I'm not a coder, but like I'm just taking tons of like LinkedIn classes, watching podcast videos like all the time, and reading. And a friend of ours, Flynn Coleman, wrote a book called The Human Algorithm, and she's been, she's brilliant. And a lot of people like Tristan Harris are making this call that everybody needs to engage with this, because if we just leave it up to the tech companies, not that they're bad, but like whether you're an artist, a policymaker, a social activist, like unless we all try to engage and influence, like the positive uses are not going to be great. So just any thoughts, like someone watching this is like interested in tech for impact, what to learn, what to upskill, or any general recommendations?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that you've just said. I think that AI is here and it's coming, and that I think that kind of learning it is really important. I think on learning to code, I think that I don't think that there's one kind of formula for it. I think you can do really well in tech without understanding how to code. You can do really well in tech without learning how engineering teams operate. I mean, you should know the high level of it, but I don't think it's super important. People like me are here to translate. That's kind of what our jobs are for. And so I think if you're interested in it, it can't hurt. And especially if you're interested in really early stage startups, like being able to jump in and code is going to be a really valuable skill set for pretty much anybody. But I wouldn't say it's required. I think like the more technical you are, the easier it is to get in early, because everybody always needs developers. And I think that the reason that developers are so highly paid, and the reason that skill set is so in demand, is because there is in the world a shortage of developers, and so there's a scarcity, and so there's kind of a lot of money chasing after too few employees. Even with the contraction, that's still certainly true. So if that's something you're interested in as a career path, I would say there's so many different avenues to get into it. This kind of everyone should learn to code mentality has led to the creation of countless coding boot camps. There are tons of good ones out there. And so if that's something you're interested in, then I would say do it. If you're interested in getting into tech on the business side, then I don't think it's 100% necessary. It's really just kind of based on your own interest. So yeah. And then I guess the last thing I would say is that, if you aren't learning AI and understanding how to apply AI, and that might mean prompt engineering. That might mean learning some of these kind of more, I forget what they're called, but the more kind of algorithm-based AI things. Like, if you go off and do this task, then based on the result of this task, do another task. I think being on top of that and understanding how that works can be really effective. And I mean, you can now get AI to write the code for an entire website for you in 5 minutes, and deploy it for you. And so I think, if you're interested in that kind of stuff, then combining those two things and having enough coding knowledge to be able to understand what it's written and to be able to kind of tweak it to do what you need, that can kind of help you to ramp up even faster.
Okay. So just two questions, we'll wrap up. So Saeed, thanks for your comment. And within the podcast, I don't think we can give direct guidance whether you do tech, impact, or public health, but you can find a lot of resources on PCDN. We have a meta job list, or free weekly newsletter, career campus. And then there's, Spring, there's Spring Activator. There's so many good places. Sam, any specific recommendations for someone in Canada who's just looking for interesting impact jobs? Do you have any favorite resources?
For impact, I would certainly recommend PCDN.
Right. Is there anything Canada specific, like, in terms of Toronto or any of the big cities?
Yeah, I'm still really kind of reintegrating back into the tech scene here. I would say look for Slack channels. Slack channels can be a really great way of kind of getting more personal interactions. There's a few. I mean, honestly, if you just Google, like there's like a product in Toronto Slack channel. There are many for different cities that are specific. And I think that can allow you to kind of reach directly to people, ask questions. Some of them have policies that are like, no, saying you're looking for a job. This is for, professional discussion. So you kind of have to choose, but those are resources that I've been trying to get into more. If you want to learn more about the African tech ecosystem, I highly recommend a podcast called Afrobility. They're great. Also, I think you've plugged Rest of the World recently, but I would just give that an endorsement. That's a great way of kind of having a kind of critical lens on what's going on outside of the North American and European tech ecosystems. I would also recommend the Not Boring newsletter. It's very general, but Packy McCormick has a lot of really great stuff on there.
Okay. So just quick comment from Alex Kennedy. No specific questions, but she just came back from East and West Africa, and she's just agreeing a lot and the definite need to build in more ethics around tech and ensure a global South perspective. So Tactical Tech does some great stuff on that. Center for Humane Technology, Illuminate, part of the Omidyar Network's doing a lot, Open Society, but any other resources? And so I guess connected to Kennedy, but also in general, any other favorite resources you have for just upskilling, learning, newsletters or books or other podcasts?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned most of mine. I guess Tech Cabal is also pretty good. They have a newsletter and a website. They have pretty good coverage. For health specifically, Rock Health is a pretty good. They're a VC firm, I'm pretty sure, but they also have a pretty good newsletter. And then, I mean, honestly, I have been really inspired by the community of founders and entrepreneurs and tech workers that I have kind of built through my professional experience. And so I really can't understate the importance of just getting involved, talk to people, go to meetups, don't be shy about reaching out. I mean, Craig, your advice that you always give is reach out with genuine interest, not just looking for a job. But I would say, if you're interested in the space, just find people. We have virtual coffees, have in-person coffees, try to develop a network of people that you can reach out to for questions and then kind of keep you on your toes as far as staying on top of industry trends and stuff. So, yeah.
And then also one other recommendation that I'll ask one last question. So what, if you're based in a city, let's say a city of 500,000 or 1 million or more, most cities have co-working spaces, innovation accelerators. Sometimes they're private, sometimes part of universities, sometimes public institutions, and so try to find, Norskin Accelerator in Rwanda, but they're all over the world. Medellin has it. So one of the best things, if you're new to a location, find not just any co-working space, but the ones focused on social impact, or just find those places. And often they're doing virtual or in-person events. And that's a great place to network at scale, not just go one by one. Do you have 4 more minutes, or you want to end more questions?
No, let's do it. Yeah, I have 5 minutes.
Okay. So Osamang, how can we use tech for more industrial market development that helps, the existing economy as a way, to get more stuff? And I think that it's a way to solve the high unemployment problem in Kenya. So any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so I think I've touched on this before, but I think that in emerging markets, and I mean, I can only really speak to East Africa, but I think this is true across the world, that there's kind of there's no such thing as, or at least, I mean, maybe in fintech, but for the most part, it's really hard to do a pure tech play in East Africa, just because the foundational infrastructure hasn't been made. And so you kind of go into it trying to tackle this small part of a problem, because that is solid entrepreneurial advice for more developed markets. But what I've seen over and over and over again is that you end up having to kind of do a lot of vertical integration and take on more parts of the stack. You might have to buy a fleet of trucks or tuk-tuks to do delivery, or develop training programs for nurses if you're in health, or whatever. There's lots of these this kind of expansion outside of just having a pure tech play. And so I would say that the potential for tech in these industries is really to instead of having what you would traditionally look at as a small engineering team, and then like kind of infinite scalability, which incidentally I think is a bit of a myth in like developed markets as well. But I think these companies really have the opportunity to be large employers, and I think that if you can kind of instill a culture of paying well, of paying above market rates, and giving people kind of access to sustainable incomes, that can go a long way. Although I don't have, I'm not sure what the actual large, like high level data is on it.
Yeah, I know somebody just shared the Job Tech Alliance, Mercy Corps, and a bunch of other private and nonprofit and for-profit institutions involved is doing amazing work on, it's not so much an industrial, but the creating workforce development opportunities across Africa, and they even have a job tech accelerator. So it's probably one of the most interesting ones, there's a lot of, MasterCard Foundation, others are trying to do a lot on how to upskill for the jobs of today and the future. And the data I have from ILO, this is old, is like we need to be creating, millions of jobs each year to keep unemployment where it is, let alone to try to reduce unemployment. Yeah. And with the gigification economy, like we're not doing very well. Yeah. So my last question is, you've talked about learning, but is there any book, podcast, TV show, streaming show that has nothing to do with work that you're just enjoying? That is enjoying, but maybe it's kind of making you think a little bit, that you might say, hey, let's check these out?
Yeah, so I recently finished a book that I would put into my change the fundamental way that I look at the world category, which is called 4,000 Weeks.
Oliver Burke. Yeah.
It's fantastic. It's about, it's kind of like about time management, but in the sense that really all you have in your life is time, and how do you want to allocate these huge life decisions on how much time do I put towards community versus work. And I think that it is just an extremely healthy perspective on how to live a kind of well-lived life. And so I recommend that to anybody. It's really amazing. I'm podcast obsessed, and I have a long list of podcasts that have nothing to do with anything that I do professionally. I would say my top 3 are probably Radiolab, 99% Invisible, and the third slot is hard to fill. I don't know. Gastropod is also really good. Let's just throw another one out there. Throughline from NPR, also wonderful. So I'm kind of constantly trying to dip into podcasts to just pick up random facts about the world and learn about things that I would not learn about anyway, or otherwise. And so that's certainly a big part of my life.
Yeah. So 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Burkeman. I think I listened to the audiobook. I didn't read it, but it's so much fun because I forgot what newspaper he writes for in the UK, Observer, Guardian, whatever. But but he goes out to develop all these time management and test everything. And as you said very eloquently, basically, you can improve time management. Time blocking does work for me the best when I do it, or kind of, let's say, bi-weekly sprints. But otherwise, most of it is you've got limited time, and a lot of it is he gets so obsessed with time management, it just creates more stress.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a fun book, but deeply insightful. So and I'm addicted to that.
The other big insight there is just, you're never going to get through your to-do list ever. Yes. It's impossible. And so learning to accept that and shrinking your to-do list is the best way to figure out.
So last question, if people want to stay engaged and see what you're writing or sharing, LinkedIn, Twitter, TikTok, what's the best channel to follow you on?
I would say LinkedIn. I have an Instagram account as well, but I think I keep that that's a little bit more private. So yeah, I would say LinkedIn is the best. I'm trying to do more of this kind of stuff, and I'm kind of early on in my journey. So there's not a ton of content out right now, but it's something that I'm hoping to do more of moving forward.
Okay. Yeah. So thank you so much for your time and wisdom and sharing, your experience, journeys, recommendations. Thank you everyone for joining us from all over, from Yemen to Kenya to Colombia to Canada, all over. Really nice group. So again, just to conclude, Season 10, Episode 15, please, the one thing, follow PCDN, Sam, on the channel, subscribe to our weekly newsletter, and please, whether it's our podcast or any other podcast, most podcasters, it's a labor of love. It's 98% of us. So the one thing you can do is share and rate. It just helps immensely if you take 30 seconds. So thank you so much, Sam. Enjoy your afternoon in Toronto. And again, thank you everyone for listening, and stay tuned for upcoming podcasts.
Thanks a lot, Craig. This was a lot of fun.
Okay.